Good evening. My name is Christopher Turner, and this is my Docudemic video presentation for Criminal Justice 4340. The House I Live In is a 2012 documentary from author and filmmaker Eugene Jarecki. The film is about many different aspects of the war on drugs and serves as a major eye-opener to the consequences of the war on drugs, which was declared by President Nixon in the 70s. Much of the course reading material provided an excellent introduction and source of understanding for the issues highlighted in the film. The panel of experts providing commentary ranged from prisoners and ex-addicts to judges and prison wardens, drug dealers to physicians, and the unintended victims, the family members and children of those who have been caught up in the draconian punishments of the drug war, which historically has been based on nothing but empty and false rhetoric by politicians in search of a platform. The first book assigned this semester was Creating Criminals by Vivian Stern, and although The House I Live In does not directly focus on the issues covered by Stern, there is an undeniable link between the economies of law enforcement and the mass incarceration effects of the drug war. The issue is bound to be addressed by Jarecki eventually. One of the events covered by the documentary was an American Corrections Association convention that advertised security services for prisons and law enforcement. These conventions, such as the annual training conference and jail expo, where dozens of industries from plumbing to dentistry attempt to profit in some way or form from the prison industry. There are dozens of these conventions every year, and they're all the same businesses, all clamoring for lucrative government contracts based on the misfortune of others. This is just one of the many ways that the drug war has contributed to the state of government spending, both on the resources that must be spent on the criminal justice and correction systems, such as the fees for lawyers and judges, as well as the salaries paid to police officers for racking up the overtime in response to drug crimes. So in many ways, not only are we paying for the district attorneys, the lawyers, and the judges, and the court fees, taxpayers are also paying for the police to make the arrest, as well as for the criminals once they're in prison. Even though I will no doubt sound like a conspiracy theorist, I cannot help but to wonder how a system that does nothing but contribute to the destruction of millions of lives continue to be utilized and even praised and made worse. Those whose interests are being served. Many may conclude that the law enforcement system in its current state is an integral piece of the economy. One of the expert panelists of the documentary, Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician in the field of addiction, makes a very interesting remark. He wonders if the drug war is not a failure. He wonders if the drug war is working exactly as planned. Another one of the panelists, former federal judge William Wilkins, states that the drug war is working exactly as planned by Congress, but the effects of that plan in regards to mandatory minimum laws and the minorities being targeted might not have been intended. In a reasonable society, leaders are able to amend their mistakes and ensure that they do not continue to ruin the lives of millions of people. If a mistake fails to be corrected, one can only wonder if the actions of the government, regardless of how malicious and in direct conflict with their purpose they are intentional. It would make no sense for government to be interested in preserving the status quo, it would make sense for government to be interested in preserving the status quo, especially when considering issues with far-reaching implications, such as the drug control strategy. However, the temperament of the public toward the drug war is changing. People are beginning to recognize the injustices of the drug war and seem to be ready for a change. Hopefully these attitudes will begin to be reflected in Congress during the years to come. The second book on the reading list was Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. As opposed to Creating Criminals, the work of Alexander is extensively utilized in this production. Alexander was most likely a key contributor to this documentary, as she appears on the panel of expert advisors on the subject. I will be the first to admit that I remain slightly skeptical of Alexander's work. However, it is undeniable that the war on drugs disproportionately affects low-income minorities more than any race or social class. First, I will discuss the points upon which I disagree with Alexander. Number one, even though the control that is exerted over those who commit drug crimes both during incarceration and once they are released is extreme and often completely paralyzing to any prospects for a normal life, the same restrictions are applied to everyone who commits such crimes, not only African Americans. It is a practice of law enforcement techniques of profiling, which is confirmed by Marshal Larry Curley of Magdalena, New Mexico, geographically concentrated law enforcement efforts on the streets of Miami, and the stop-and-frisk culture of big city cops, which are questionable and for the large part to blame for the disparity in racial arrest rates and subsequent sentencing practices. However, when considered in combinations with America's history of racial repression through law enforcement, particularly the drug laws, it becomes very hard to remain blind to claims made by Alexander. Perhaps one of the most interesting historical facts of the documentary was contributed by Richard Miller, a Lincoln historian. According to Miller, racial targeting through drug laws began during the late 19th century. Opium dens, where many would go to smoke opium, were associated with the Chinese and were legal all throughout America at one time. However, Chinese immigrants were beginning to make an impact on the American economy by offering cheaper labor than typical Americans at the time, especially on the West Coast. A political need arose to implement some form of control over the Chinese. But how? By making opium dens illegal in California, the government now had a reason to target the Chinese people in America and exert some form of control over their destinies. The same methods were used at the turn of the 20th century when cocaine became associated with African Americans, then again 30 years later during the Anslinger years when a crusade against marijuana, which was associated with Mexicans providing cheap labor, was undertaken by the American government. We have seen similar campaigns in modern times that target certain drugs and the low-income people who are associated with those drugs. For example, the crack epidemic of the 80s and the meth craze of the 90s. Also of note is Miller's chain of destruction, which describes a methodology used for achieving the widespread public support of an eradication of an entire race. Although it seems that such events could not possibly occur in America, the effects of the drug war become dangerously close. It is clear that the law enforcement targets certain areas and certain people when arrests need to be made and overtime is abundantly available. However, the burden of responsibility will always fall upon the person committing the crime. Nobody has the power to force anybody to commit a crime. Free will is truly colorblind. However, with the current state of criminal justice and the redundant and ineffective nature of punishment, it is not surprising why so many offenders eventually return to crime as a means of survival. The next book that was assigned was When Brute Force Fails, and it was by Mark Kleiman. Once again, The House I Live In is not directly focused on alternative and more effective methods of punishment, but it is clear that Kleiman's book is relevant after being introduced to those who are serving the hardest time and the stiffest sentences for drug crimes that do not even pose a threat to the overwhelming threat to society. In many ways, even though the documentary was essentially concerned with other factors, putting a face and a story to the victims of the drug war and those who suffer because of draconian drug laws is more effective at convincing the general public over the severe injustices to which millions are exposed on a daily basis. There is little doubt that millions of people currently serving punishments which do not fit the crime would benefit from sentencing reform. Many offenders who find themselves incarcerated for drug crimes felt that they had no other choice but to turn to illegal activity at the time. They had been laid off from their blue-collar jobs due to factories closing and businesses moving out of inner cities. They had families to support and turned to one of the only sources they knew to be profitable when they faced the prospect of unemployment and an inability to provide. Another reason why Kleiman's work is relative is because it has long been established that the drug war is not working, and Kleiman highlights several different programs and initiatives that have shown to be successful in dealing with drug deterrence and addiction treatment. The nonviolent offenders who appear in the film, such as Anthony Johnson and Maurice Holtenwanger, would perhaps have a second chance at life instead of serving stretches of their adult lives in correctional institutions. When they are released, they will likely have no skills, no job prospects, and be worse off than when they were arrested. The call for a change in sentencing and punishment reached a point of crisis a long time ago. President Obama has signed into law a reduced comparison between cocaine and rock and powder form, but progress can easily be erased upon increased sense of fear when new drugs hit the streets, and politicians call for stiffer penalties in order to gain votes from middle-class parents who watch too much TV. It is on this list where the most impact must be made. Just as many of the prisoners know, any change that might improve their situation must be reflected in the attitudes of the voting public. There must first be a call for the recognition of such issues. There must be those who are willing to protest and call attention to the matters. I could guarantee that changes would no doubt be made if a wave of drug incarcerations hit suburban white America. It is known that white teens are more likely to experiment with drugs than black teens and are just as vulnerable to the draconian drug laws as the user or small-time peddler that is currently overcrowding much of the cells in today's prisons. But we do not see stop-and-frisk techniques being utilized at bus stops in upper-middle-class neighborhoods, nor do we see drug raids busting down custom-made doors and interrupting family reflection time. It is sad to say that might be exactly what is needed before serious consideration to changing law enforcement techniques to fighting the war on drugs. The book, The Last Neighborhood Cops, is probably the least relative to the issues discussed in The House I Live In, but when one looks closely they can really see between the lines into the long-reaching effects that the deterioration of community policing had upon the housing projects of New York. During the documentary, we are introduced to the inhabitants of the housing projects of New York. One of those inhabitants, or I should say ex-inhabitants, Dennis Whidbey, represents the vicious cycle that occurs on a daily basis to low-income families and neighborhoods throughout the country. Dennis, who would have probably been growing up in a time when COP was declining in the late 70s and early 80s, talked about who kids on his neighborhoods really looked up to. He recalls his childhood when the local drug dealer would show up with a trunk full of fashionable footwear and would tell kids who were fortunate enough to be at the round at the time to grab a pair. These kids would then be seen around the neighborhood with the latest shoes and would tell everyone where they got them. The local drug dealer would also buy all the kids ice cream and would help out with bills and groceries when money was tight around the home of children. The local drug dealer would come around. The film exhibits, a young Dennis Whidbey felt like it was Christmas every time the local drug dealer would come around. The film exhibits the exact same social conditions occurring on the streets today, with local drug dealers buying children ice cream and serving as role models as a generation of misled youth. The youth which Whidbey describes and what the viewers witnessed during the course of the film was how the community now places their faith and trust in a criminal instead of in each other or in the police. The replacement of the values and trust which was built over years of community policing no doubt fell apart in housing projects all over New York City under similar circumstances. Whidbey's son, Anthony Johnson, is yet another link in the vicious cycle that plays out on a daily basis across the country. Johnson, a nonviolent offender, is facing a lengthy prison sentence for drug violations, also declares that his role models growing up were hood-famous neighborhood drug dealers who were symbols of money, power, and respect. He is also father to a beautiful baby girl who he has never even met. I am not saying that community policing would have prevented anybody from becoming a casualty of the drug war, but it stands to reason that there are some children who grow up in housing projects who would have been better served by having positive relationships and influences in their lives that come from someone else other than a drug dealer. Building strong relationships between neighbors and between communities and law enforcement was one of the many benefits of community policing, and one that without a doubt had positive influence on the lives of many low-income families who grew up when it was widely practiced. Although not a direct focus of the film, a viewer who has been introduced to the concepts and benefits of community policing can no doubt see how such an institution could put those who are at the highest risk on a different path before they are too far gone. What is grossly evident is the fact that the current system simply does more harm than good, and the continued resistance to change is tantamount to the sanction by the government and the people of the United States of the destruction of millions of lives on a daily basis. It is painfully clear that a change must be made when modern police officers admit to the fact that they view the general public as an enemy, and the public views the police as symbols of oppression. Again, the issues that concern the next assigned book may not be directly addressed by the film, but like many issues that have been examined thus far, the connections that exist between seemingly distant concepts can be subtle, yet invariably connected on one level or another. No matter how loud our shout is yet another place where major impact could be made if effective practices of reform were implemented, and it is painfully obvious in the faces of Maurice Halton-Wonger and Anthony Johnson, who are more than likely in the midst of serving long prison sentences at this time, but whose future could have been very different if problems were properly dealt with when in the hands of juvenile court. Both recount experiences that might have led them to this situation. Neither had a relationship with their father, and both more than likely had alternate role models as children. Identifying the factors that put at-risk teens even more at risk is one of the key areas that need to be addressed when attempting to make positive, effective change early in the lives of juveniles. The kids who are the focus of no matter how loud I shout probably serve as a great example of what the lives of Maurice and Anthony, and then the majority of prisoners currently in prison, might have been like when they were growing up. Most had lost one or even both parents to prison or to tragedy, and endured tough circumstances that many of those passing judgment never experienced. I am not trying to say that there are any circumstances which would justify the continued life of criminal behavior, but the failure to effectively correct such actions in juveniles in the absence of parental figures should not fall completely upon the state, but they should not fall upon the shoulders of children either. In those terms, the state is largely responsible for the eventual recidivism of the youth. Although the guardians of the children are without a doubt directly responsible for contributing to their actions, the punishment and effective rehabilitation is more than just a one-man job. When it comes to juvenile justice in the drug war, the right formula has been elusive to say the least. The implementation of drug courts and the increased surveillance and therapeutic treatment available to juveniles and their families, as shown by the alternate forms of punishment described by the works of Kleiman, which would have shown to be effective. Also of paramount importance is keeping young and impressionable teenagers away from hardened criminals in a prison setting by avoiding the use of harsh mandatory minimum sentencing. According to Charles Ogletree, who was a producer for The House I Live In, a major problem that we have ignored in the United States is the number of black people who are sentenced to long sentences for non-violent drug offenses, which has led to entire generations of children believing they are destined to enter the criminal justice system at some point in their lives. By continuing to ignore this problem and even becoming an active participant in a neglect to make a change, we directly contribute to the constant deterioration of entire generations of minorities who are targeted by law enforcement. And if current trends continue, each generation will be worse than the generation who preceded them. Today, 2.7 million children in America have a parent behind bars. These children will more than likely be incarcerated in the future. To be aware of such a possibility yet have no power to make a change is a failure of the entire system. The fact that sooner or later sentences are served and people who were once prisoners are released into the community is the focus of When Prisoners Come Home by Joanne Peter-Cilia. The final reading assignment of the semester. The House I Live In is focused on the many effects that drug policy has had upon the community, particularly low-income minorities. One of these effects, which the film discusses, is the lack of employment opportunity in a legitimate enterprise that awaits those who are released from prison after serving time for a nonviolent felony drug conviction. And the answer, for the most part, is slim to none. Many programs whose purpose was to educate and train convicts have long since been cut from state budgets. Today, prisoners face longer prison times with nothing to show for it once they are released. Programs directed at assisting prisoners who want to achieve advanced degrees by attending college have been cut on the basis that law-abiding citizens should have access to financial aid resources over convicted felons. Many policymakers who take such a hard line on crime, correction reform, feel that they are completely justified in the denial of opportunity to criminals. Those who elect such policymakers feel safer at night knowing their politicians are not soft on crime. But how much safer should we feel? How much better should we sleep at night knowing that prisoners will eventually be released who have been hardened by the system and are unable to provide for themselves by legitimate means? Since when is it in the public's main interest to force people to resort to crime in order to survive? Why, when it has been shown that recidivism is reduced when inmates are trained or educated in some way, do politicians move away from such policies? Are they that short-sighted? Is it hard enough to find an employer willing to hire convicts? It is hard enough to find an employer willing to hire convicts, but it is even tougher to find one who is willing to hire unskilled laborers, even if they had clean records. It seems that Dennis Woodby was lucky enough to find work as a grocery clerk. Perhaps with time he can work his way up to a management position. But many of those released from prisons are not lucky enough to have a job, and many do not have the patience or the desire to work their way up to a grocery clerk manager. Perhaps the son of Carl Hart, a criminal justice professor at Columbia, said it best when he told his father that he cannot raise his children on a job that pays $7 or $8 an hour. Hart's son also happened to be facing criminal drug charges and would no doubt know firsthand the difficulties of trying to survive without legitimate employment prospects. The lack of opportunity combined with simple human needs is a clear contributor to this decision and the necessity to commit crime. It seems that we have gone out of our way to make a legitimate life for those who have made mistakes in the past a near impossibility. Society is so entrenched in the traditional treatment of crime and criminals that reform seems like a concept from which a distance is steadily growing. I believe The House I Live In spanned the reading material very well, whether directly addressed by the filmmaker or not. There is without a doubt a link between the issues discussed this semester and the drug war in general. The panelists also offer great insight about the war on drugs and the implications it has upon society. It will be interesting to look back on this period of time in the future in hopes that the lessons of history will have finally been learned. Thank you. That concludes my presentation. I hope you like it. I hope it raised some decent points, and I hope you were able to follow with it along well. Thank you.